Hey everybody, how are you today? So today we're going to be talking about Chapter 12, Section 1. So we're moving into the New Deal. So we're going to be talking about how Franklin Delano Roosevelt gets elected president in 1932. And in his basic, campaign across the country, he claims happy days are here again. And so he creates this program to try to combat the Great Depression called the New Deal, where he's going to be really redefining what a democracy is, increasing the power of the president and of Congress, becoming more involved in the average American's life, trying to provide economic security, trying to ensure political rights for people, trying to create social justice. And his New Deal programs really are going to reform the way that Americans live their lives. So when we say the New Deal, we're talking about just the name of, his policy to fix the Great Depression, and it's going to be full of actual pieces of legislation or laws, individual programs to create jobs aimed at relief, recovery, and reform. So our goal for today is just to understand what the New Deal is, how President Roosevelt really tried to fix America, and what some of those individual programs were. Today's notes are kind of long. I'm not going to lie about that because we're going to be covering Section 1 today, and Section 1 has a lot of information. This might be one of those lectures that you have to hit pause, stop it, and then kind of come back to it. And then I'll also be posting the notes under classwork on Google Classroom. So in 1932, when FDR and Hoover were running for the presidency, most Americans were not going to re-elect Hoover. Obviously they blamed Hoover for the Great Depression, and we saw that clearly when they were living in these Hoover hotels, which were really cardboard boxes, these, towns of them called Hoovervilles, sleeping with a Hoover blanket, which is just a newspaper, having a Hoover flag, which is, their pockets inside out, clearly empty. So they're blaming him about the Depression, saying that the programs he did try to pass, like the Federal Farm Bureau and some of these other things really just were not enough to fix the Depression, especially programs like POOR, the President's Organization for Unemployment Relief, were just a joke. And they weren't really doing anything to help fix America or to create jobs. His public works program, like the Hoover Dam, was just too little too late. And so his small efforts at fixing America were just not enough. And of course, then when you had the Bonus Army incident, that kind of sealed the deal. And so when people came to vote, you can see it with the popular vote. About 40% of Americans voted for Hoover, and that's because they're Republicans, so they find themselves wanting to still vote for their president. And then the 57% of the popular vote went to FDR, but of course it's really the Electoral College that elects the president. And it's based off population, and you can see that 89% of the electoral vote went to FDR, so he won by a landslide. And he promised the American people a new deal, and he promoted confidence and independence, and it seemed like he had a plan to get America out of the Depression. And everything with Hoover was just the same. It was not just an economic depression, but it was just depressing to think about, and that things were never going to get better. There was all this mental health involved, and FDR seemed like he was a bright star on the horizon. He projected confidence. You see a picture of him there. He'd been a man who'd been involved in politics for several years. We'll watch the first part of the president clip about him later. He's kind of a two-parter. We watch the first part of his president clip at the end of this chapter, and then we watch the second part of his president clip in our next chapter in World War II, because he's the only president to serve 4 terms. He isn't in the office of the presidency until he dies, which shows you that the American people loved him. After his time in office, they created term limits to limit how many times someone could get elected to the presidency. And, as president, he had this amazing wife named Eleanor Roosevelt, who really helps him to project this image of confidence. He was not a healthy man. In the early 1920s, he had run as vice president of the United States, and he had lost with the Democratic candidate in the 1920 election. And then he kind of retreated from politics for a while because he got polio as an adult. It made him very ill. Today there's a vaccination against polio. There was not back then. He was incredibly ill and weak. He couldn't walk for a long time. And he spent the rest of his life really kind of residing in a wheelchair, but he was able to walk a little bit with metal braces on his legs. And the media was fantastic. They basically had an unspoken deal with the media to only shoot him as a strong, healthy, confident man. So if he was standing in a picture, he usually was holding on to something, but they didn't show what was really happening, which was that it took someone to help him get into place to then stand to hold on to a podium and such before he made his inaugural address. If they shot him driving a car, they didn't show that he had a special car with special pedals to be able to drive it. So they always make him look healthy and strong because that's what America needed. Someone who was healthy and strong that could guide the American people. They don't show the truth about him. And in his inaugural address, he talks about how the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, meaning we're so afraid of the future and the unknown and the depression getting worse and the fact that capitalism is perhaps failing and we're going to be this communist country. And he says, you just need to stop it. Stop letting anxiety control you and panic. Believe in yourself, believe in me, believe in the American people, and I promise you bold action. I promise you leadership. I promise you change. I promise you a new deal. And remember, as you do these notes, feel free to just write down what's in bold, but they're your notes. Write down as little or as much as you want. Now, one of the things he starts doing pretty much immediately into his presidency is what's called fireside chats. And most Americans had a radio at this point. They gained a radio during World War I. They bought one. During the 20s, they bought them in installment plans if need be. And first, we started off with just CBS and NBC. Then we get ABC. So there's multiple radio networks. People would listen to the radio, to hear spy shows and mystery shows and superhero shows. And they would listen to it for all sorts of, entertainment, for escape, but of course also to get their news. And so what FDR did was he says, okay, most people still have a radio. They've sold a lot of their possessions, but someone in their community, even in their Hooverville, has a radio so that they know what's going on in the world and they could all huddle together. I'm going to talk to the people. And he would get on the radio and he wouldn't talk down to them. He seemed like he was just a regular guy, someone you could relate to. And he says, okay, I see you're scared. I see you're worried. I see you're hungry. I see you're starving. I see you. So he's empathizing with them. And he says, feel free to write me letters. Feel free to tell me what you need, what you want. But me and my wife, Eleanor, are here to bring about change. We're going to fix America. And he talked to normal people on a regular basis. And then he would tell stories about the normal people and the problems they were facing. And he said, I'm going to try to pass laws that helps farmers, that helps women, that help African Americans, that help the stock market, that help middle-class business owners, that help, average Americans who work in a factory. So he's going to try to help anybody and everybody. And so by doing this, he was able to make Americans feel like they had a future and like a president who cared, and they felt connected. And it was one of the reasons he definitely gets elected in 1936 and in continual elections, because people felt like they could connect to him. In modern day America, President Trump took to Twitter, and he was very quick to comment on Twitter about, his opinions on things. And it was a way for him to connect with a lot of people. The radio was the social media of the day. And so this was FDR's way of connecting with the people. So as he creates the New Deal, which remember is his plan to deal with the Great Depression, it's going to involve many different laws being passed by Congress. And those laws are going to be aimed at relief, recovery, and reform. And so when we talk about relief, it's about giving immediate help. Recovery is about getting the economy back going again. And when we talk about reform, it's about trying to help America in the long term, whether we're talking about banks or ending child labor or farmers, whatever it is. But the overall goal is to get America back to where it was, if not better. Get Americans back to work, get that 25% overall unemployment rate back down to the normal 5% where it should be. So the goal is to save capitalism and to get Americans feeling good again. Now, is everybody going to like these programs? No, not at all. There's going to be a lot of people who criticize these programs because remember, these programs do not end the Great Depression. The Great Depression does not end until 1939, 1940, when America's in World War II producing wartime goods. So his programs help, improve the Depression, but they don't end unemployment. They don't end the Depression. And a lot of the programs, some people say, go too far, give the president and Congress too much power, make America too much like communism. So there are a lot of people who question the programs. And you can look at this picture here where it looks like Uncle Sam is America. You can tell he's Uncle Sam still because he's got his red, white, and blue pajama pants on. But Uncle Sam is sick in this picture. He doesn't have his typical top hat on. It looks like he's got some slippers, which say US on there. And um, it looks like FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, is this cowboy-esque looking doctor. And he is bringing for Uncle Sam all these different New Deal remedies. And you can see all the different New Deal remedies on the table there. And they are a bunch of acronyms because in this chapter, the different New Deal laws, there's so many of them get passed during FDR's time in office. We refer to them as basically alphabet soup because they're all acronyms. So like the one with the big eagle, the one that's the biggest bottle standing up at the top, that's NRA, okay, the National Recovery Act or the National Industrial Recovery Act. And then you've also got CWA there, which is the Civil Works Administration, and the CCC, the Civil Conservation Corps, and the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act. It just goes on and on and on. But these are all different laws the government will pass and that are referred to by their little acronym, their little letters, the alphabet soup there. And that's what Uncle Sam is basically feeding, or Uncle Sam is being fed there by the president. And Congress is this creepy looking nursemaid in the picture. And the doctor is saying to Congress, President Roosevelt saying to Congress, of course, if we don't change, we may have to change remedies if we don't get results. So what we're getting at here is that, people were criticizing FDR because he's got all these plans, but he may not actually be able to help America in any way, shape, or form. So part of the reason why Franklin Delano Roosevelt is such a fantastic president is he was willing to get viewpoints from many different people. His wife Eleanor was very interested in education, in helping children, in African American rights. And so since he really had physical difficulties in terms of walking, she would kind of be his eyes and ears, and he would send her to labor protests, to protests about African American rights, to visit people who were out of work, and then to come back and give them information. But he also knows that he has to rely upon a cabinet which will be made up of incredibly smart people. He calls his cabinet the Brain Trust. And remember, the cabinet is the group of advisors who help the president. And these advisors are head of the Commerce Department, head of, trade. So we call them Secretary of Commerce. They don't answer phones or anything as a secretary. They report back to the president. And we have, Secretary of State, which is in charge of foreign affairs and such. Well, he makes up a cabinet, which is full of people who are teachers, lawyers, journalists, social workers. So they're not just, in the past, a lot of the times, cabinet members have been made up of people who were best friends with the president, who didn't have any real experience, who were really rich. So basically, they either got the job because they voted for the president, were friends with him, gave him money to help him get elected. And Roosevelt knows that's not going to work. He needs to pick people to be part of his cabinet who have real experience in the field, people who can give him, ideas to shake things up. And one of the things that he did that was pretty revolutionary was he includes Democrats and Republicans on his cabinet. So, of course, the Republicans are not going to agree with any of the president's plans and policies. So why include them? Because you want to hear the other side of the coin. You want to hear the opinion. You want to hear about, okay, I want to do this, but what is your group going to think? And what's the potential drawback of this? He knew he was going to receive criticism, and he didn't care. He wanted to do whatever was right for America to fix it and what we needed now. And he was willing to continuously change things and experiment. And people criticize him because he didn't have the right answer, but nobody did. So his cabinet is made up of mostly men, but he will include Frances Perkins to be on there, and she will be the first female on the president's cabinet. I thought I included a picture of her today, but I guess not. I'll have to go back and try to find one. And so that was a big deal that he included a woman on his cabinet. And so he was really kind of breaking the mold as far as, women's rights. We also know that he had many African-American advisors. Some people called it his Black cabinet to help him, get ideas about how to assist the Black community. And so he really is breaking barriers in terms of, referring to women, African-Americans. And it's unclear about whether Frances Perkins was LGBT or not, but there are many stories today that perhaps she was. So perhaps that was the first LGBT person on a cabinet. So he's definitely a breaker of barriers, this man. really kind of has a groundbreaking cabinet to assist him. So during his first 100 days in office, March 9th to June 16th, he's going to get 15 laws passed as part of his New Deal program, which we often refer to as, like I said, the alphabet soup because they have so many different letters. Now, if you notice, the president takes office here in March. He will be the last president that takes office in March. And the 20th Amendment to the Constitution is going to get passed at this point. And so from here on out, the president takes office January 20th. Honestly, it was really dumb because before this point, you would hold the election the Tuesday after the first Monday in November, okay? The Electoral College usually votes December 16th, December 20th. It's like the second Wednesday in December or something. I don't know, the second or third Wednesday. And yeah, then the president, the outgoing president, was still in office all the way to March. And so a lot of people weren't really focused on him anymore. They were focused on the new president coming in. It was kind of what we called a lame duck presidency because he couldn't really do a whole lot, he felt like. You know, Congress didn't really want to work with him. And they had been like that for all of American history. So finally, they passed the 20th Amendment to the Constitution, which says the president will now take office January 20th. So that's going to be one change. He's the last president to take office in March, and then when he gets reelected for a second term, he's going to take office there in January. So in terms of the policies passed, during his first New Deal, most of the policies he gets passed are going to be aimed at relief, trying to help people get through, get them food on the table, get them a place to sleep, that kind of thing. Some of them will be aimed at recovery, trying to get businesses back up and running or farmers to not lose their farms. Not a whole lot are aimed at reform, though, trying to fix America in the long run. One of the most important things that he passes during this time period is called the Emergency Banking Relief Act. Basically what he does, he says, okay, and he says this on a fireside chat, so, people really buy into it. He says, I have passed this Emergency Banking Relief Act. It's part of this Glass-Steagall Banking Act. I'm closing all the banks in America for a 10-day holiday. During the 10 days, I'm going to have these bank inspectors go around to every bank in America and declare the banks are safe, they can reopen, and then you can start depositing money back in and you won't have to worry about losing your money ever again. Now, in all reality, did the president probably have people go to every single bank in all of America? No, probably not. But this made people feel safe. The fact that the president, was looking into the banks, was guaranteeing banks, it really worked. And 10 days later, when the banks reopened, people put their money back into the banks again. And, you have to remember, this is how banking works. You deposit some money while they withdraw some money, and it all kind of evens out. It's just when you have all these people taking out $20,000, $30,000 at the exact same time and demanding every single dollar, the bank has a problem because they don't actually have those funds physically on hand. Part of the other piece of the banking legislation that was part of this Glass-Steagall Banking Act is they create something called FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Company or Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. If you go to the bank today, you will still see this on the doors of your local bank. It's usually right there on the front door along with the times that the bank are open. So what this said was, we promise, okay? We guarantee that your money will never be stolen for you again up to $5,000. So if you have more than $5,000 in your account, we're not guaranteeing we're going to give you any more than that back, but we will never steal from people basically again. And the banks are overseen by the Federal Reserve System. They should have protected the banks earlier. They did not, but this is going to guarantee protection. This is one of those long-lasting impacts of the New Deal. We still have this today, and today your money is guaranteed up to $100,000. So it's a pretty impressive piece of legislation. It makes people feel safe about banking. It gets banks to reopen. It gets money back in circulation. It gets people wanting to take out loans again. We're trying to get lower interest rates to people, and so it's going to start getting things back up and running. Going along with banking and stocks, the government also creates a new regulatory institution called the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission. They're going to be watching over the stock market because what was happening during the 20s was that, people were almost lying about how well the business was doing, and then it led to stock speculation. People were paying way too much money for a stock. It really wasn't even worth that much. They were kind of overestimating the prices of the stocks and their worth. So the goal of the SEC, really and truly, is to prevent fraud. And it stops things like insider trading. So you can't like give insider tips to someone about how a company is doing, anything like that. So this important piece of legislation, just like FDIC, is still around to this day, and it's tried to, make sure the stock market is a legitimate place where people can buy and sell stocks, and the prices of stocks are not getting overestimated. Now, that's not to say that scandals don't ever happen. Just a little over a decade ago, there was a huge scandal with Enron, a big corporation. It turned out they were like committing fraud. They were claiming that they were making profits and people were buying stock in their company, and they had thousands or millions invested because they thought this company was doing well. And it turned out, guess what? The company was bankrupt. And then, of course, once people found that out, the price of the stock dropped to zero, was worthless, and people lost millions. So terrible things do still happen, but they try to stop that from happening. They also create FARA, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. The purpose of FARA was just to give people food. And so, just like for the most part, Hoover was all about voluntarism and localism. People were only going to get free food and a place to sleep if they went to their local church or shelter or soup kitchen, and they might have to wait in line all day to have that happen. The government is now in the areas where unemployment is 30-40%, they're going around and they're giving people $5, a shirt to wear, a coat, some food, something to get them by. And so this was kind of an early precursor to food stamps and such, but it was just a temporary measure. It doesn't last for very long. Now, part of the first New Deal is also going to be a lot of laws are passed to get Americans back to work. And this one is aimed at relief, at getting Americans back to work. It's also aimed at recovery, kind of stimulating the economy. And one of the most famous and most successful programs is called the Civilian Conservation Corps. They employed young men, usually between the ages of 17 and 30, and they got paid $30 a month. Most men kept $5 to $8, and the other $22 to $25 went back to their families to live off of. And what these men did was they went across the country and they built trails, like through the Grand Canyon. They planted trees. They cleaned up pollution in streams. They slept in army barracks. They were given uniforms because, they were focused on conservation and fixing our environment. And they were civilians, but they were working with the army. And most men loved working outside, had a sense of accomplishment and achievement, had some spending money, and they didn't have to worry about food to eat or a place to sleep or what to wear because the army was providing that stuff for them. And the rest of their money went home to their families who could have food, shelter, and buy goods to kind of stimulate our economy. Another program that was passed was called the CWA, the Civilian Works Administration. This one was only around for a short time. The Civil Works Administration does all sorts of different things, but they build about 40,000 schools, and then it provided salaries for about 50,000 teachers in rural America. They build roads. They also go ahead and they build some public parks. So this was a joint operation as well. And this one is going to really kind of help clean up a lot of towns, get a lot of kids back in school. Because remember, we said so many kids had dropped out of school for 2-3 years to try to help their families look for work. And, the president and Eleanor said, his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, said, no, we have to get kids back in school. We just absolutely have to. We have to get kids to be able to read and write, and especially in elementary school, and do basic math. We're doing them a disservice if they don't. Let's build roads. Let's build schools. Let's get an education for teachers. Let's pay for teachers' salaries. We need to focus on the next generation kind of in the long term. So in terms of relief, this gave people jobs, but it also kind of was aimed a little bit at recovery and reform because we're thinking about in the long term, we're going to need another generation of educated Americans. And we need roads and we need parks and we need things for these kids to play on. Now, these two laws in particular were also aimed at people's homes. And we see that FHA is created, which is the Federal Housing Administration. And it provided home loans to people so that they could buy a home without having the full money down. This is one of those long-term lasting New Deal programs. The FHA is still around to this day. So most people, when they go to buy a house, let's say they're going to buy a $200,000 house, you're expected to put 20% of that money down. Okay. So if you're buying a house that's $200,000, 10% of that is 20,000. Okay. You just move your little decimal point over in case you don't know that for quick math. And so you double that, so that's 40,000. So you have to have $40,000 down just to buy a $200,000 house. So that's a lot of savings. You don't necessarily have to, but that's kind of the golden rule, is to have 20% down, especially to have an affordable mortgage payment. And then you still want to have, a low interest rate each month, something that you can afford. Otherwise you have to think about how are you going to be able to pay for your mortgage plus all of your other bills. So FHA comes out and it says we're going to try to come out with lower interest rates. And so back then, people didn't have as long of a time to pay off their mortgage. Nowadays, most people have 30-year mortgages, so they can pay off their home over a 30-year span of time. And a lot of these loans that people are getting are from this organization, FHA. Now, there's also something called HOLC, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, and this one basically just extended out the loan payments with lower interest rates. So a lot of people up until this point, it's not like FHA that was giving out brand new loans to people so they could buy a new house or build a new house. HOLC was saying, look, you're supposed to be paying off this house over a 15-year period of time. You don't have enough. You don't have the $1,000 a month to, make that monthly mortgage payment. How about now we change it and it turns into a 30-year period of time to pay off that house, and now you only pay $500 a month, which seemed a lot more affordable, or whatever the payments might have been. So it extended the amount of time you have to make the loan payments, and it gave you lower interest rates. And these programs, many of them are still around to this day. One of the more controversial programs of the first New Deal is the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act. And the purpose of this was to really help farmers in the long term. In the short term, we also see the FCA, which is at the bottom there on the right. The FCA was the Farm Credit Administration Reform. So the FCA, the Farm Credit Administration Reform Act, basically made it possible for farmers to refinance their mortgages and the loans on their farms. So yet again, instead of it being 15 years, to pay off the land that was their farm, now they have 30 years to repay off, the loan that they took to buy that farm. Or it was at lower interest rates. But the Agricultural Adjustment Act, back to that one I should say, it basically pays farmers not to farm. It paid farmers, who agreed to reduce production. So they said, okay, we don't want you producing as much cotton or wheat or tobacco or whatever it is that you grow. We want to let the land go fallow, let it gain the nutrients back. Let's have crop rotation. The idea is if you have a smaller amount of food, the prices will go up. And so this is going to help farmers because the price of corn goes up, the price of wheat goes up, and so they'll end up making a profit. And then they can use that money to buy more farm equipment, more cars, more tools back into the economy. And remember, 25% of Americans are still farmers at this time. And a lot of farmers had really been hard hit by the Dust Bowl and other things. The only problem with these laws is that in particular, a lot of these laws, we still saw racism involved. They sometimes didn't help African Americans as much as they helped white farmers. We saw some discrimination there in place in some of these programs. Farmers who'd already lost their farms and now were sharecroppers, tenant farmers in the South. It did nothing to help them get their farms back. This law will later be ruled unconstitutional because they say it's too communist-like. It's telling farmers too much what to do. Did it work? Yeah, in the short term, it did work. But a lot of people criticized FDR for it because it is increasing the price of food during an economic depression. One of the most significant and important laws, and I just realized I have this picture up here twice, which I don't know why. I was supposed to have that picture. So I don't know. I messed up there, clearly. I got to fix that. Is the Tennessee Valley Authority. The Tennessee Valley Authority is a hugely important law. It brings electricity to the South, okay? And it brings electricity to the South by basically creating all these dams. And it's really important because it involves civil engineers, it involves construction workers, it helps create dams throughout the South, it helps create electricity to a lot of rural areas, brings them to more of a modern era. A lot of people criticized FDR for it, though, because you can see all the dams that they built there just in Tennessee alone. The government basically chose which construction companies and engineers were going to be able to get these jobs. And so, yet again, they claimed favoritism and such. But it did help kind of modernize a little bit of the South here and create electricity. So this is one of the most famous and more popular programs of FDR under his first New Deal. We're almost done. We've also got the National Industrial Recovery Act, the NIRA. So I didn't name this stuff. It's kind of dumb. The law is called the National Industrial Recovery Act. It's actually run by a group called the NRA, the National Recovery Act. The National Recovery Act is not the National Rifle Association. Don't get confused. It's the group down there. You can see that blue-colored eagle. The idea here was if you were a member of this National Recovery Administration, you were going to be partnering, where it was going to be businesses and laborers and workers and the government working together. And the goal was to basically end the Depression by saying, we're only going to let a factory hire so many people and have them work so many hours and get paid so much. So that way, even if a factory does not complete all the work there is to do, build another factory, hire more people, create more shifts over there, let them produce part of the product. So you're sharing kind of the work, making it kind of spread around and creating more jobs for more people. Basically, during this time period, it's why child labor comes to an end, because there's so few jobs available. They're only going to be hiring men compared to children. And unfortunately, there's a lot of sexism there. They're not hiring women. They're not hiring African Americans usually as much. And this is where we get minimum wage, because the idea was you needed to pay someone a minimum amount of money to help them feed their family, during this time period. So we create minimum wages. They also create price controls saying you're only going to sell the product for so much money. And the idea was that if all the companies were, selling for so much money, they were making somewhat of a profit, but the business owners weren't going to get super rich. They were going to pay their employees a little bit extra with this minimum wage mentality. And so they're creating, fair competition between companies, and the workers were also allowed to join unions. Now, did this program work? Yes. I mean, it got people back to work and it stimulated the economy. It definitely, follows trickle-down supply-side economics like Hoover thought of. It's helping big businesses, but as well as small businesses. It helps create jobs. It gets people back to work, and then they can go out shopping and buy more goods. But it's heavily criticized. People say it's like communism because the government's telling you where to work and how much you'll get paid and how much to sell your goods for, and, if you can join a union or not. So it's later ruled unconstitutional, and some people say it didn't really do a whole lot to help small businesses compared to big businesses. And last slide, part of the NIRA, the National Industrial Recovery Act, was the PWA, the Public Works Administration. And the Public Works Administration went around the country and they used basically this law so they could rebuild public parks, roads, bridges, levees, dams, schools, you name it. And it got a lot of people back to work in terms of relief and recovery as well. So overall, was his first New Deal from 1933, 1934 successful? For the most part, but some of the laws were so controversial and so involved in people's lives that they're later ruled unconstitutional, but at least FDR was doing something to improve America during this time. All right, guys, that's it for now. Have a great day.